Right, welcome back everybody to the second part of this morning's meeting. We're moving on now to item 10 on the agenda, which is the NHS performance. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is. Item 10. No, item 9, I apologise. I knew I was all over the place. Digital health services by 2020. And Tim, please, we're very interested to hear from you on this.
Well, actually, it's interesting. So following on from the conversation we just had, Carolyn and I went to a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary and various others to talk about the importance of this. And actually one of the core roles I think nationally we have the opportunity of doing is setting standards for, in a way, letting local autonomy be real. So this paper is essentially proposing, as part of a very substantial piece of work that's being overseen by the National Information Board, that NHS England confirm its commitment to the development of a core set of digital standards that need to become part of the basic licence to operate, as it were, for people, organisations that wish to treat NHS patients. The benefits case for interoperability or safe digital record keeping is now overwhelming, I think, and as a result of which we of course have many places, many organisations in this country that are setting global standards in interoperability. We've got fantastic examples of that at University Hospitals Birmingham, in Oxford, but also in some of our district general hospitals. Northampton, for example, has just developed and implemented a real-time record-keeping system on its wards so that in the middle of the night doctors are making safe decisions about prescribing and getting automated reports on nursing observations, and that on its own they now report has reduced the error rate of in terms of misdiagnosis by 300%. So I won't go into all the details, but essentially the evidence case is strong. We also have some good emerging evidence of the productivity benefits. We've talked about that a lot, the efficiencies, opportunity, and one report which we've commissioned, hasn't yet been published, suggests that just doing the basics, simply having what you could describe as supply-side automation, second nature if you're Tesco's or Asda, in your warehouses, could save as much as £3 billion a year. And it sort of makes not only common sense, but I think it's almost self-evident that we should be doing that. Instead, the vast majority of our hospitals in particular are operating on fax machines, quite literally held together by bits of string in terms of treasury tags and patient records. As set against the extraordinary achievement in primary care, where we now have 100% digital record keeping, and with that we're able to do some very unprecedented things like offer patients access to their own records, for example, and start the revolution that we have been discussing, the transformation that we've been talking about. I would hope that the board would recognise this as an important moment, because I think the history of technology in healthcare has been that it's operated in a kind of silo from the mainstream operations of patient services. And what we're now saying is that by 2018, providers who do not meet these standards, haven't implemented them in primary, urgent and emergency care services, won't be commissioned to provide those services, and similarly by 2020 for all other services. And these are clearly very ambitious targets. They're not as ambitious as they might initially appear. So apart from the fact that, as I say, we have pockets of excellence already gripping the digital opportunity, we have also been developing some programmes, the summary care record, for example, where we're seeing very, very rapid rates of adoption as clinical staff, management begin to realise the benefits that these kinds of data sharing arrangements can bring. So just to give you an example, currently GP summary care records are being shared with 111 between GPs and 111 and A&E departments in now nearly 50% of the NHS in England, and that's a dramatic increase on the situation last year. So to some extent it's ambitious, but we're building on a solid base of commitment, I think, in the health service. What we're saying in terms of the timetable is that we will hope to develop in collaboration, not just with provider colleagues, other organisations, the NHS Confederation, Foundation Trust Network, these standards and around them the kind of commissioning and regulatory environment that will support their delivery, but also to work with patients and community organisations just to start, in a way, articulating better the benefits case for implementation of these kinds of standards. By June, we hope to publish guidance. That's the commitment the National Information Board has made, guidance to the NHS, to the health and care system on what the standards should be and how to go about implementing them. And by April of 2016, we're proposing that both individual organisations, provider organisations, and local area commissioners will publish roadmaps for attaining those 2018-2020 objectives. And they will be supportively held to account for delivery of their own milestones through those roadmaps, through a process of kind of audit, and we've called that the Digital Maturity Index described in the paper. So this will be a transparent reporting and self-assessment of the degree to which local health economies are achieving these objectives over the next few years. So in closing, I would just not underestimate the challenge of achieving these standards and their implementation. But I would say that I think we particularly given our history over the last decade of not getting this right, have adopted an approach which I hope will be embraced by local frontline services, because what we're basically proposing is a small but core set of standards, the NHS number, which need to be implemented, but leaving to them the decisions about how those standards are implemented, with whom they work, which IT companies they might work with, and so on. And we want there to be a range and a diversity of different approaches. We think that's what people are asking us to give them.
Thank you very much, Tim. Let me invite comments. No.
Briefly, Tim, we heard earlier from Ian on the new models of care, which PACS in particular require interoperability as a critical enabler to make them work. Are we aligned sufficiently on the timeline between your NIB universal initiative in introducing interoperability and what our new models of care will need? And if there's misalignment in any sense for good reason, how can we help the Vanguard sites in particular in an accelerated way?
Yeah, so Ian and I have been talking, and I've been talking to Sam and various other colleagues about this very, very intensely over the last few weeks, because it's very clear to all of us, and indeed the Vanguards are asking for support to make real not just these kinds of interoperability objectives, but also other aspects of the digital opportunity, the data opportunity that they want to embed in their approach to new models of care. So we will need to provide a sort of package. We haven't yet, of course, designed that with them, but a package of support to secure exactly that objective. And for that reason, Simon has also asked if we can embed in all the kinds of initiatives that we are incentivising with over the next period of time, a sort of set of core basic requirements around adoption of digital standards. So, for example, we would expect any local health economy or provider that is being incentivized, receiving funds from us for transformation, to use the NHS number 100% of the time, basic stuff. And we're just discussing at the moment what those 5 sort of high-impact digital requirements should be, almost preconditions for being in the family of transformation that we're working with. So that's something we're discussing at the moment. But your point is extremely well taken, and certainly we will need to support the Vanguards and other innovators to get to the point of interoperability faster than we would expect necessarily everyone else to do it.
Margaret?
In a way, this goes back to the question that I asked of you and Karen earlier on, but it's sort of building on that, and it's about the other standards, if I can call them that, the standards for meeting our obligations with regard to ensuring patient security, patient privacy, and also system security and so on. And with regard to that, is there, I think what I can see is if I was in charge of a CCG, for example, or if I was a GP, I would want to own all of the data and keep everything, sort of because it makes one have greater control over output and just the way in which you're interacting with patients. But it strikes me that the metadata and the ability to respond to requests that might come from patients would be assisted if the CSUs were able to support in the way that would mean that they had a greater control over systems and formats and so on. And I'm wondering whether there's anything that we should do to encourage that cooperation with CSUs or reliance on CSUs.
Yeah, well, so I think there's one really important principle which we just need to kind of get round, which is that what the National Information Board and NHS England has said and the 5-year forward view has said implicitly is that from now on, any confusion about whose data this is resolved. This is the patient's data. The GP has the privilege, or the doctor, whoever, the nurse has the privilege of, in some cases, acting as a custodian for that data, but it is the patient's data. And what we've said in the National Information Board's framework is that by 2020, we want people to have the complete control over who it is that accesses their data. So consent, we want to move to a consent-based system. In the meantime, we've got to work out how we maximise the advantage to patients and citizens of that data being used to the maximum beneficial clinical effect. And I think there are lots of ways in which we can support local health economies, particularly in the vanguards, to start deriving both real value at the bedside in terms of greater interoperability, which is what I just said, but also, if I'm getting your meaning right, to start looking at this data much more effectively as a source of insight into a real-time and rapid improvement in the quality of services provided, assessing outcomes and so on. And I think CSUs absolutely have a role to play in that, in helping sort of bring analytic and other capabilities to bear. The security issue, which we discussed just briefly before, is obviously it's core that we can't trade privacy in any sense for the clinical benefits that we can derive from interoperability, but recognising we live in a digital world where security can't be 100% guaranteed all the time. Obviously, we need to meet the highest standards. So the development of that new rubric around what a safe health system looks like in a digital age is one of the core priorities for the National Information Board as a collective to solve. And Dame Fiona Caldecott and others are deeply engaged in working through what the principles of that kind of commitment, that new contract, if I could put it like that, should be.
Thanks. I've got just before I do, could I just ask all colleagues to move mobile phones well away from microphones? It does distort the signal. Victor and then David.
I think we've got to get on with it. I'm really overdue. We just need to get on with it. But some time ago, I was curious about patient data, patient citizen data, and the possibility that individuals might receive some kind of report on how their data has been used.
Yeah.
And you were quite keen on the idea, as I recall. I just wondered what progress had been made. I mean, we just need to do this. I mean, it's over it, but I just wondered about that particular bit.
Yeah. Well, so we're committed to three bits there. So first thing is, very rapidly, certainly during this next calendar year, people who access their own GP records, as they now can do, as of the end of this month, will also be able to access a kind of an audit trail of who else has seen their records, because that's something that's already collected. And so creating visibility of that to the patient is important, and we can do it. So let's, as you say, we're going to do it. More complex is the other commitment that the National Information Board has made to giving people some insight into how their data is being used when it's being used for analytic purposes. So, a researcher over here or a NHS, NHS England over there, who's using my data to what benefit, really, just to explain to people how their data is contributing, let's say, to a better understanding of variation in outcomes in diabetes. People want to know that. That's a more complex technical issue, but we are committed to resolving it and to provide people with sort of, as far as we can, kind of full transparency around the uses of their data for those purposes as well. And the third thing is that we want people to be able to actually write into their own records so that there's a kind of parity between the clinical voice and the patient voice in determining appropriate solutions for a person's health and care journey, a kind of almost like a personalised care plan for the 21st century. And we've committed to that taking place in 2018. So I think there's a radical a radical commitment to transparency of users of data and of people who are accessing your data, given it's your data and you should have the right to decide who sees it.
Tim, clearly this is table stakes for any form of modern health and social care system, so health and care system. So as Victor rightly said, we need to get on with it. In terms of encouraging people to get on with it, there's one way which is the sort of the club, which I think you're sort of deploying, and then the other way is the sort of the motivational aspects. And actually, the best way to do that, I think, is to get the patients themselves to demand it.
Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, are we doing enough, particularly in building apps or enabling a market to build apps that we are supportive of? Are we being sufficiently aggressive in communicating the benefits and showing people the benefits of owning and seeing their own data in a way that actually gives the providers who might be reticent no alternative, because people are just going to be unwilling to accept that they cannot get hold of their data and use it?
Well, it's a really big question, but the one amazing thing that has happened in the last 12 months is that the community in general practice, which did have the technical facility to do this, has decided to do it. So although it's contractually required, actually there's been an enormous recognition of the potential benefits in general practice. So when your hospital colleagues or colleagues in social care are looking, we've got a very large constituency that's already saying, well, we've just done it. And I think that's a helpful narrative which we need to make the most of and haven't yet started to do. But I couldn't agree more that raising, in a way, activating the citizen to demand access to these kinds of services, because I'm sure they are going to. So trying to make sure the NHS is ready for that demand as it comes is a very important objective. And indeed, this week we launched the first mental health app store on NHS Choices, backed by the NHS, because we know that digital tools work to drive up access to talking therapies, and people want it, and the NHS just hasn't expressed an opinion on whether these things work or not.
It seems to be a strategic theme for us, because again, in terms of thinking about how we can engage people in preventing illness and condition as opposed to suffering it, in inverted commas, I think is a very key part of our agenda going forward.
Yeah, completely agree.
So may I come back on this? Is it that I completely agree with the imperative to just get on with it, but there is the backstory which is still in my mind, and I think that what I'm asking is this. As you build your very large and important multi-room building, every time you want to build to extend it, that we as a board have an opportunity to look and check that the building regulations requirements have been met, if I can put it that way. So we'd need periodic reports to give us comfort about the systemization and how it's working.
Yeah.
That would make me feel comfortable, and I'll be quiet.
And I completely welcome that. I think we have to be transparent in every direction, certainly transparency to the board of the way in which this multi-room, if that's the right concept, this process is being developed so that it's safe, it's clinically compliant, it's actually benefiting people in a really measurable way. It almost goes back to your genomics point. Why would we do this rather than physiotherapists? It's really critical. So I would certainly welcome that.
Okay. Look, I think we're all clear. Get on with it. But the issue is, look, this is what Derek Wanless wrote about in 2002, for goodness sake. I mean, the outcomes he held out for the NHS in 2002, we still haven't got there. Yeah. I would now like to invite the board, on your behalf, to approve the current priority list of digital standards for 2015-16, and to support the future priorities for 2016-18. We're happy to do that. And to confirm our intention to use all available commissioning levers to get on with it. So, Tim, thank you for this. I think this, I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was a high historic moment, but I do think that it is, something of a turning point, and I hope that you feel you've got the full support of the board in taking it forward.